Okay, so how do you even begin to grasp the uh, the immense story of American history? It's just
Mm.
so vast, so complex, right? Without feeling like you're totally drowning in names and dates and, let's be honest, often conflicting stories.
Oh, yeah, it's a real challenge.
That's basically the challenge we're taking on today. Our mission on this deep dive is really to cut through all that information overload. We want to unearth the most important nuggets, maybe some surprising facts, and those crucial connections that help you truly understand the unfolding story of the United States.
Hmm.
And for this journey, we've pulled from a pretty rich stack of sources. We're talking everything from historical textbooks, encyclopedias, the foundations,
Right.
but also government documents, detailed reports on specific eras. So it's a solid foundation to build our understanding together.
And, our goal today isn't just about listing what happened. It's more about digging into why it matters and maybe what it means for us right now today. Because as we go through the centuries, you really see these continuous threads, don't you?
Mhm.
Themes of American identity, these challenges that keep popping up, and just the incredible evolution that shaped the country.
Yeah, precisely. Our ultimate goal is for you, our listener, to walk away feeling genuinely well informed, to get those aha moments where
Yeah.
history clicks into place,
Right.
and hopefully without feeling overwhelmed. Okay, so let's unpack
Let's
this.
do it.
Let's start way, way back. Before any European ships, even sighted these shores, we need to talk about the earliest inhabitants, the ones who laid the continent's first foundations.
The Paleo-Indians.
Right, the Paleo-Indians. And over thousands of years, they diversified into hundreds of culturally distinct groups all across North America. And some of these early cultures were just remarkable, like the
Oh,
Mississippians,
yeah, Cahokia.
Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis. And what's just mind-blowing is that at its peak, this is the 12th century, Cahokia had an estimated population of 20,000 people.
Which is huge back then.
It was larger than London at the time, can you believe that? Centered around this massive earthwork, Mumps Mound.
Yeah, 100 feet tall, incredible engineering.
And then you go out southwest, and you've got the Anasazi, or ancestral Pueblones. They started building these intricate stone and adobe pueblos, around 900 BCE, often right into cliff faces.
Like Mesa Verde.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Stunning.
And what's really striking when you look at these early groups is just how sophisticated and diverse their governance structures were.
Right.
Like take the Iroquois Confederacy in present-day upstate New York. They formed this powerful alliance of tribal peoples probably around the mid-15th century, so long before European contact.
Mm-hmm.
You had the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes, and each one had seats in this central council of 50 sachem chiefs. It was this complex system balancing tribal autonomy with, collective decision-making.
That's fascinating. You mentioned their system might have even influenced later political thinking. How exactly did the Iroquois Confederacy, with that kind of unique structure, potentially shape how the founders thought about the U.S. government?
Well, it's a really powerful connection and honestly often overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
Scholars have pointed out that the Iroquois model, this idea of a strong, unified governing body that still respects the sovereignty of the individual nations.
Right, federalism, basically.
Exactly. It provided a really compelling model of federalism.
Yeah.
And its principles, things like consensus building, having a written constitution, they call it the Great Law of Peace. These ideas resonated with thinkers like Benjamin Franklin. He observed their system, admired it. It suggested that, different groups could unite under a shared framework, which was a pretty radical idea for the colonists who were trying to figure out their own future government.
So from these really rich indigenous foundations where you had these complex societies thriving for literally millennia, the stage just gets dramatically reset with the arrival of European powers. It just fundamentally changes the continent's trajectory. The Spanish, for instance, they set up St. Augustine down in Florida in 1564. That's considered the first permanent European settlement in North America.
Right. The oldest continuously inhabited European settlement.
But for the story of the U.S., as we generally trace it, the focus often shifts to the English. You've got the first successful English colony at Jamestown, Virginia Company, 1607.
Yeah, after a few false starts elsewhere.
And then, of course, the Puritan colony up at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, the Mayflower story.
And looking at those early British colonies, what often gets missed is just how different their economic foundations were. And that really set the stage for later regional clashes, didn't it?
How so?
Well, think about New England. The soil was poor, rocky.
Yeah.
You can do large-scale agriculture easily.
Right.
So it naturally evolved into a center for commerce industry. They harnessed rivers for mills, built ships, and harbors like Boston became these crucial trading hubs. Boston was a major American port very early on.
Okay.
But then you look at the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. They had much better farmland, but also a huge degree of ethnic and religious diversity.
Ah, Pennsylvania. William Penn.
Exactly. Established in 1681 by William Penn as like a haven for religious dissenters. You had Quakers, Methodists, Amish, all sorts of groups.
Hmm.
And Philadelphia, its capital, just boomed, became a dominant commercial center, really embodying that vibrant, more pluralistic society.
Okay, so here's where it gets, tragically complex, and it really lays the groundwork for centuries of struggle. We turn to the southern colonies.
Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia.
Overwhelmingly rural, developing an economy built primarily on agriculture and, crucially, on enslaved labor. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Jamestown in 1619, that was just a pivotal, devastating moment. Initially, the sources say some were regarded maybe more like indentured servants with a possibility, however slim, of eventual freedom.
Right, the lines were blurrier at first.
But by the 1660s, that brutal institution of slavery just hardened. It became lifelong involuntary servitude.
Expert, can you maybe expand on how that shift happened so quickly, and what were the long-term consequences for these fledgling colonies?
Absolutely. The hardening of slavery was really driven by relentless economic demand. The tobacco plantations and later rice and cotton were just incredibly lucrative.
Cash crops.
Huge cash crops. And they needed an ever-increasing, permanent, and crucially cheap labor force. As demand for these crops soared in Europe, the economic incentive to just control labor permanently became overwhelming.
So the laws followed the money, pretty much. Laws were gradually put in place to strip enslaved people of any rights they might have had, making their status hereditary, passed down through generations and perpetual.
Yeah.
And the long-term implication, it was profound and devastating.
Yeah.
It embedded this deeply racialized caste system right into the fabric of American society. It fueled immense wealth for a few, while creating just unbelievable suffering and injustice for an entire population. And it defined social, economic, political divisions that we're still grappling with today. By the 1770s, enslaved Africans heartbreakingly made up a fifth of the entire American population.
A fifth. Wow. That inherent contradiction, then, this demand for liberty happening right alongside the brutal practice of slavery. It leads us straight into the American Revolution and the founding documents. The Second Continental Congress votes to declare independence July 2nd, 1776. 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence, largely penned by Thomas Jefferson, is formally ratified. And it famously declares all men are created equal with these unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And critically, it demands the consent of the governed. These were truly revolutionary ideals for the time.
But then you get the period right after the Revolution, under the Articles of Confederation, and that was a real trial by fire for the young nation.
Yeah.
And it really raises that important question. Why did this first attempt at a national government, forged in that spirit of independence, ultimately fail so badly?
What did the sources say? What were the key weaknesses?
Well, several big ones stand out. Congress lacked the fundamental power to levy taxes. It could only request money from the states.
Which often didn't come, right?
Exactly. The states often just didn't pay up, leaving the national government basically broke.
Okay.
And then, any amendments to the Articles needed unanimous approval from all 13 states.
Impossible.
Pretty much impossible. Rhode Island, for instance, single-handedly shot down a crucial revenue proposal. Important laws needed approval from 9 out of 13 states, which made decisive action incredibly difficult.
Gridlock from the start.
You got it. And Congress just couldn't enforce treaties effectively or regulate foreign trade or even trade between the states. These structural flaws were obvious pretty early on, even before the war was officially over, and they pushed the new nation right to the brink.
So these glaring weaknesses, this feeling of a nation just kind of adrift, it all culminates in the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia, May 1787. And it was originally called just to revise the Articles, right? But the delegates in this, truly audacious move, they quickly went way beyond that. They created an entirely new constitution.
Right, a complete overhaul.
Ford Washington was elected presiding officer, which gave it immense credibility, of course. And the document was eventually signed by 39 of the 42 delegates who were actually there at the end.
But getting it ratified was a whole different ballgame. It wasn't smooth sailing at all. It needed 9 states to approve it for it to take effect. New Hampshire became the 9th state on June 21st, 1788, so that officially put it into effect. But what's really crucial to understand is just how narrowly it passed in some of the key big states. That really reflects how divided the country was.
Like Virginia and New York.
Exactly. Virginia ratified it just a few days later, June 25th, but only by 10 votes. And New York, on July 26th, squeaked by with just 3 votes.
Wow, that's close.
Incredibly close. And both of those powerful states, Virginia and New York, critically recommended that a Bill of Rights be added. That was a major concession to the anti-federalists, who were deeply worried about a strong central government trampling on individual liberties.
And that push led directly to the first 10 amendments.
Yep, securing those fundamental rights.
So following that nail-biting ratification, George Washington becomes the first president in 1789. And his early presidency was just pivotal, wasn't it, in defining federal power, establishing its authority.
Absolutely critical.
Beyond just setting up tariffs for revenue and creating a national bank, which caused huge debates.
Hamilton versus Jefferson.
Right. He personally led troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, and that wasn't just about stopping a protest, was it?
No, it was a statement.
It was a clear, dramatic declaration that this new federal government had the muscle and the will to enforce its laws, a huge precedent for national authority over state or individual defiance. His successor, John Adams, he had to navigate the quasi-war with France, that undeclared naval war, and controversially passed the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Which definitely raised fears about government overreach, freedom of speech.
Then Thomas Jefferson's presidency brings the massive Louisiana Purchase in 1803, just doubled the size of the country overnight.
Incredible deal.
Followed by Lewis and Clark heading out to explore it all. And then James Madison, he inherits all these tensions that eventually boil over into the War of 1812.
That's right, against Britain again.
Okay, so as the nation matures into the 1840s, we start seeing this idea of manifest destiny really taking hold, this powerful, often kind of romanticized belief that the U.S. was, destined.
By God, essentially.
Yeah, by divine right, inherent superiority, whatever. Destined to inhabit and govern the whole continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, let's unpack this. Expert, beyond just wanting more land, what was the core ideology behind it? And what were its immediate and frankly tragic consequences for the people already living there?
Well, Manifest Destiny was this complex mix. It was fervent nationalism, absolutely, but also a strong dose of religious zeal, this idea of spreading democracy and Protestant values, and unfortunately, a heavy undercurrent of racial superiority. The argument was that it was America's providential mission. But the tragic reality, as you said, was the forced displacement and, in many cases, the systematic destruction of Native American nations.
Right.
This ambition led directly to policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed under President Andrew Jackson.
Ah, Jackson.
Yeah. This act forced tribes, often called the 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, who had adopted many European customs.
It's the name.
Exactly. Forced them to abandon their ancestral homelands east of the Mississippi and undertake this brutal forced march west.
The Trail of Tears.
A Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
It involved over 60,000 people. It was a humanitarian catastrophe. And, it wasn't without strong opposition even then.
Oh, really?
Yeah, people like Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett publicly condemned it. He famously vowed to move to the wilds of Texas rather than live under Martin Van Buren if he continued Jackson's Indian policies.
Huh. Crockett.
His defiance really highlighted the deep moral unease some people felt, even amidst the expansionist fervor.
So as the nation is pushing relentlessly westward, the divisions over slavery just keep intensifying, threatening to rip the country apart. By 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, slavery wasn't just entrenched, it was actually growing.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
Over 4 million Black people were enslaved in the U.S. at that point, more than at any time before in the nation's history. Expert, just how deeply connected was slavery to the economy of the entire nation, not just the South, but the North too.
Oh, it was absolutely central. It wasn't just a Southern issue, economically speaking. Southern plantations, especially cotton plantations, were incredibly profitable. European demand for raw cotton was immense.
King cotton.
King cotton, exactly. A staggering 75% of the world's cotton came from the American South by 1860. But the North was deeply, deeply implicated.
How so?
Northern cities and industries, banking, shipping, textile mills, were directly tied to and profited massively from the slave system. Northern ships carried the cotton, northern banks financed the plantations, northern textile mills in New England processed the raw material harvested by enslaved people.
Wow.
And on top of that, the South gained disproportionate political power because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Counting enslaved people as three-fifths of a person for representation boosted Southern states' power in Congress and the Electoral College. It's this huge economic engine that fueled both sides of the nation, making the conflict just incredibly difficult to resolve peacefully.
So the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform explicitly opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, that was the breaking point.
The final straw for the Deep South, yeah.
7 Southern states immediately seceded, formed the Confederate States of America. 4 more states joined them soon after, and this led directly to the Civil War, starting in 1861, ending with the Confederate surrender in 1865.
And the Civil War remains the costliest, deadliest war ever fought on American soil. Around 620,000 soldiers killed at about 2.4 million who fought.
Just staggering numbers.
Yeah. And early on, any hopes the Union had for a quick victory were just shattered at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861. The Confederates forced a larger Union army into a panicked retreat.
Right.
But the tide did begin to turn. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863 was huge. It didn't just declare enslaved people in Confederate territory free. Strategically, it allowed the Union Army to recruit black soldiers.
Transforming the war's purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It became explicitly a fight for freedom. Then you have the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, a critical Union victory, a major turning point. And Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's destructive march to the sea through Georgia in 1864 further crippled the South's ability to keep fighting.
And then, tragically, just days after the war effectively ended at Appomattox, April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
A profound shock to the nation.
That same year, the 13th Amendment was adopted, officially outlawing slavery nationwide. A monumental step, obviously, but one that opened the door to entirely new and incredibly complex challenges.
Yeah, which brings us to the Reconstruction era, right? 1865 to 1877, a really challenging, tumultuous period. Initially, President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, favored a pretty lenient approach.
Presidential Reconstruction.
Right. It didn't require Southern states to grant voting rights to black men to rejoin the Union, but Congress pushed back hard. They pursued what's called radical Reconstruction, passing the first Reconstruction Act in 1867, which was much stricter. And what's truly remarkable about this brief window is the rapid, radical expansion of civil rights through constitutional amendments.
Reconstruction Amendment.
Exactly. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, guaranteed equal rights and citizenship for black people, a massive change. And the 15th Amendment, in 1870, prohibited using race to deny men the right to vote. The goal was clearly to secure voting rights for black men.
And these changes did lead to some significant, though often fragile, gains, right, for black Americans initially.
They did for a time. The first black colleges were created, Howard University, Fisk University, providing vital educational opportunities that hadn't existed before.
Right.
And black men began participating in government at levels never seen before or since, really, until the modern civil rights era. Figures like Hiram Revels, the first black senator from Mississippi, yeah, and Robert Smalls, a Civil War hero who became a congressman from South Carolina. It really seemed for a brief shining moment that the promise of full citizenship might actually be realized. But yeah, that progress was met with just a terrifying and incredibly deadly backlash. White Southerners, determined to restore white supremacy, resorted to widespread fraud, intimidation, and outright murder to dismantle Reconstruction's gains.
This is where groups like the Ku Klux Klan come in.
Exactly. The KKK emerged in 1867 as essentially a white terrorist organization. And by 1874, you had paramilitary groups like the White League and the Red Shirts openly intimidating and attacking black voters, often with complete impunity from local authorities.
And the sources detail some horrific violence started.
Do harrowing examples. The 1866 Memphis Massacre, where white mobs killed an estimated 46 black people, brutally raped rural black women, burned black churches and schools.
Unbelievable.
In 1873, the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, white mobs killing at least 150 black men trying to overturn an election and disenfranchise black voters. You have individuals targeted too. Abram Colby, formerly enslaved, elected to the Georgia legislature, was dragged from his home and brutally whipped in 1869 simply because he refused to switch parties or resign.
Just brutal.
Daniel Blue in North Carolina, 1869, his pregnant wife and 5 children were murdered after he testified against the Klan. Black women were specifically targeted with sexual violence, rape, Brutal attacks, all intended to assert control and terrorize the entire community.
And they targeted symbols of progress, too.
Absolutely. Black churches and schoolhouses, symbols of black independence and advancement, were routinely burned. Teachers and students were murdered. Like William Luke, a white teacher working with black students, lynched along with 4 black men in Alabama in 1870. It was systematic terror.
And this violence was coupled with economic exploitation, right? Through systems like sharecropping.
Yes, sharecropping emerged as a way to control black labor after slavery was abolished. It effectively trapped black families in endless cycles of debt and dependency on white landowners, preventing any real economic freedom or independence.
You also mentioned legal setbacks undermining the amendments, like the slaughterhouse cases. What was the impact there?
Right. The slaughterhouse cases in 1872 were a huge legal blow to the promise of the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court dramatically narrowed its scope, especially the Privileges and Immunities Clause.
Oh, so.
Essentially, the court made this distinction between state citizenship and national citizenship. They argued the 14th Amendment primarily protected rights related to federal citizenship, not necessarily those rights protected by state citizenship.
Which sounds technical, but what did it mean in practice?
In practice, it severely limited the federal government's power to protect civil rights against discriminatory state actions. It basically gave states much more leeway to chip away at the civil liberties of black citizens, undermining the amendment's intent and paving the way for decades of segregation and disenfranchisement under state law.
So Reconstruction officially ends in 1877. White Southern Democrats regained political control across the South.
The quote-unquote redeemers.
Right. And this leads to widespread disenfranchisement of black citizens through all sorts of insidious methods, poll taxes, literacy tests, felon disenfranchisement laws, all designed to get around the 15th Amendment without explicitly mentioning race.
And it worked. By 1900, the number of black registered voters in Louisiana, for example, had plummeted from about 130,000 during Reconstruction down to just 5,000.
Wow.
These actions effectively reestablished and codified racial hierarchy through Jim Crow laws, mandating segregation in every aspect of life and continuing economic exploitation. It created a system that profoundly shaped the South and the nation for generations.
Okay, let's shift gears now, moving into the Gilded Age, late 19th century, early 20th. This is the period where the United States transforms into the world's leading industrial power. So, expert, what did this industrial boom really mean for the average American? What was maybe the most surprising or impactful change they would have experienced? Was it really gilded for everybody?
That's a great question. And no, it certainly wasn't gilded for everyone. For ordinary Americans, the changes were just dramatic, almost disorienting in their speed and scale.
Like what?
Well, imagine being born in the 1840s or 50s. You'd see light sources go from candles to kerosene lamps to electric light bulbs in your lifetime.
Right.
Transportation shifts from walking and horses to steam trains, electric trolleys, eventually cars. You were likely born into an agricultural society, but you experienced this massive industrial revolution that radically changed how and where millions of people lived and worked, moving from farms into these rapidly growing, often chaotic cities.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of that technological and societal upheaval was just unprecedented. It fundamentally altered daily life, work, family structures, everything.
But this era, despite that glittering surface, also brought huge challenges, right? Wealth inequality was extreme.
Off the charts. The top 10% of families owned something like 3/4 of the nation's wealth. Yeah. And meanwhile, many workers faced low wages, incredibly dangerous working conditions, frequent unemployment, which inevitably fueled massive resentment and led to the rise of the labor movement.
And some major conflicts there. What were some of the most significant moments of labor unrest? What do they reveal?
Oh, the Gilded Age was definitely a period of intense class conflict. You had the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It lasted 52 days, involved workers across the country, and was eventually put down by federal troops, but only after more than 100 deaths.
Wow.
It really showed the government's willingness to side squarely with industry against labor. Then there was the tragic Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886. A bomb exploded during a labor rally. Police fired back. People died on both sides. It led to the arrest and execution of anarchist labor leaders. Even though their direct guilt was highly questionable, it created a huge backlash against radical labor. And then the Pullman strike in 1894. Widespread railroad strikes and boycotts triggered by George Pullman cutting wages in his company town, but not lowering rents or prices. Again, federal troops were called in. These events just starkly highlighted the deep inequalities, the harsh conditions, and the powerful, often violent resistance workers faced from both industrialists and the government when they tried to organize.
So all these widespread social, economic issues, they fuel the next era, the progressive era, right?
Yeah.
Roughly 1896 to 1917,
Mhm.
characterized by the strong desire for change, for reform, trying to address the rampant corruption, the inefficiency in government, the terrible conditions in urban slums, the severe labor exploitation, all the problems the Gilded Age had created or worsened.
And a key figure here is definitely President Theodore Roosevelt.
Hmm.
TR served 1901 to 1909.
The youngest president.
Youngest president, yeah, took office at 43 after McKinley's assassination. And he really embodied that progressive spirit, this energy for using government to achieve public good. He famously wielded the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up powerful monopolies. The trustbuster, exactly. He notably took on J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, which controlled almost all railroad shipping in the northern U.S., and took them all the way to the Supreme Court and won.
Wow.
But maybe even more remarkably, he broke new ground in the 1902 coal miners' strike. Instead of just sending in troops to crush the strike, like previous presidents might have done.
Which was the standard playbook.
Right. He acted as a neutral mediator between the owners and the workers. That was a clear departure, signaling a potentially more active interventionist role for the government in labor disputes.
The progressive era also saw a major reawakening of the women's suffrage movement, didn't it? Around 1912, intensifying the fight for the vote.
Yes, absolutely. You had figures like Alice Paul, International Women's Party, using more militant tactics.
What's a silent
Silent Sentinels, picketing the White House day after day. They were arrested, jailed, went on hunger strikes. It drew huge national attention and a lot of sympathy.
And then World War I comes along. How did the war impact this movement, and what was the ultimate significance of them finally winning the right to vote?
World War I was actually a crucial turning point. The massive participation of American women on the home front, taking over jobs in factories, farms, offices, volunteering, just fundamentally undermined the old anti-suffragist arguments that women were somehow unfit for public life or citizenship.
Right, they proved their capabilities.
Exactly. Their patriotic contributions demonstrated their vital role in society. And that momentum, combined with decades of relentless activism, finally led to the adoption of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, prohibiting discrimination in voting based on sex. It was just a monumental victory. It fundamentally expanded the definition of citizenship and political participation in America. A huge step.
So following World War I, we enter the famous Roaring Twenties, 1918 to 1929. Though it actually starts in the shadow of something terrible, right? The Spanish flu pandemic.
Yeah, 1918, 1919. Devastating. Claimed around 550,000 American lives. A really grim start to the decade.
But despite that, the economy then expands dramatically. It's the era of jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, this incredible flowering of Black artistic and intellectual life. Figures like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington.
Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston.
Right. But expert, this era was also full of deep contradictions, wasn't it? It wasn't all flappers and jazz.
Not at all. The Roaring Twenties were this fascinating paradox. You had cultural innovation, economic prosperity for many, the sense of modernity. But at the same time, it was a period of deep social and political conservatism for others.
Like the KKK resurgence.
Exactly. A troubling resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, expanding its targets beyond just African Americans in the South to include immigrants, Catholics, Jews, particularly in the Midwest and other parts of the country. And this era also saw really strict immigration limits imposed by the Immigration Act of 1924. Quotas based on national origin, designed to limit immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. It reflected this growing nativist sentiment, this anxiety about preserving a perceived American ethnic identity. So yeah, a time of both exuberant modernity and profound anxieties.
And this era also brings us Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, 1920, outlawing the manufacture, sale, import, export of alcohol nationwide. Expert, what did this sort of grand social experiment ultimately reveal about American society and government?
Well, Prohibition was this monumental attempt at social engineering, right? And what it really revealed was just how incredibly difficult and often counterproductive it is to legislate morality on that kind of scale.
Yeah.
It led to widespread defiance. Bootlegging became a massive industry. Secret bars, speakeasies popped up everywhere. Estimates were like 30,000 in New York City alone by 1927.
30,000.
Yeah. And maybe most significantly, it fueled the dramatic rise of organized crime. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago. His organization reportedly raked in $60 million in 1927, mostly from illegal alcohol.
Wow.
It bred disrespect for the law, corrupted police and politicians, and ultimately showed the limits of government power over private behavior. After 13 years, it was finally repealed in 1933 by Franklin D. Roosevelt, a clear recognition that it had largely failed.
And the Roaring Twenties themselves came to this abrupt, devastating end. The Great Depression starts really in August 1929, but punctuated by that infamous stock market crash in October.
Black Tuesday.
Black Tuesday. Millions thrown out of work, 4 million by 1930, soaring to 15 million by 1932. Homelessness skyrocketed. And then on top of the financial crisis, you get the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl.
Right. Severe drought, massive dust storms, devastating agriculture from Texas up to Nebraska, just adding misery upon misery.
Expert, here's where it gets really interesting looking back. The role of the Federal Reserve. Economists have debated for decades whether the Fed's actions, or maybe its inactions, actually made the crisis worse. Can you maybe clarify some of those economic ideas like the real bills doctrine or liquidationist beliefs? And how did the Fed's approach kind of fall short?
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial for understanding why the Depression got so deep and lasted so long. The Fed, even though it was created precisely to stabilize the banking system, was really hampered by internal disagreements and, frankly, a flawed understanding of what was happening.
Okay.
Some Fed officials clung to this thing called the real bills doctrine. Basically, they believed the Fed should only lend money against short-term business loans, like for inventory, not act as a broad lender to banks facing runs or liquidity crises.
So a very narrow view of its role.
Very narrow, and that constrained their response. Then you had others, including Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who subscribed to these liquidationist beliefs.
Liquidationist, what does that mean?
It basically held that downturns were necessary to purge rottenness from the system. Mellon famously advised Hoover to, quote, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. The idea was to let weak banks and businesses fail, let prices fall, and the market would eventually cleanse itself.
Wow, that sounds harsh.
It was incredibly harsh and economically disastrous in this context. This belief prevented the Fed from acting decisively as a lender of last resort during the banking panics. They didn't inject enough cash into the system when banks desperately needed it.
So banks just kept failing.
Exactly. A cascade of bank failures which shrunk the money supply, deepened the recession, and turned it into a global depression. Their efforts, when they did act, were widely seen by economists later as just too little, too late.
Okay, so that stands in stark contrast to President Hoover's initial belief against direct government intervention.
Right. Hoover favored voluntary cooperation, limited relief.
And then Franklin D. Roosevelt comes in and takes this decisive experimental action with his New Deal, starting in 1933. Expert, how did Roosevelt's approach fundamentally differ, and what was the lasting impact of the New Deal on the role of government in American life?
Well, FDR's approach was just revolutionary compared to previous responses. Where Hoover emphasized limited government and voluntary action, Roosevelt embraced direct federal intervention on a massive scale. Relief, recovery, and reform were his goals.
Right, as the 3 R's.
The 3 R's. And the New Deal fundamentally expanded the role and the size of the federal government in the economy and in the daily lives of ordinary Americans, really forever.
Through programs like the WPA.
Yeah, the Works Progress Administration,
Yeah.
the WPA, is a great example. From 35 to 43, it employed 8.5 million people. They built roads, bridges, schools, parks, huge infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam, the Lincoln Tunnel, LaGuardia Airport, even Mount Rushmore had WPA workers.
Wow, a visible legacy.
A very visible legacy. But beyond infrastructure, the New Deal created the Social Security Administration a crucial safety net for the elderly, the unemployed, the disabled. It passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help struggling farmers. It enacted laws protecting workers' rights to organize unions.
So a fundamental shift.
A fundamental shift. It permanently changed public expectations. It established this principle, really, that the federal government had a responsibility to ensure a basic level of economic security for its citizens.
And this immense period of hardship, the Great Depression, it's finally brought to a decisive end by World War II.
Yeah, the war mobilization did what the New Deal couldn't fully do.
The U.S. enters after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The entire country mobilizes. GDP skyrockets, unemployment basically vanishes. New opportunities open up for women, for Black Americans in the workforce, effectively ending the Depression. Expert, what's maybe the lasting paradox or the key takeaway from this intense period of national unity during the war?
That's a great point about paradox, because while World War II was undeniably a period of immense national unity, shared purpose, incredible sacrifice, leading to economic recovery,
Right, the good war.
often called the Good War,
Yeah.
but it also revealed and, in some cases, exacerbated deep-seated injustices within American society itself. The most glaring example, of course, is the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans.
Executive Order 906, exactly.
Exactly, based solely on their ethnicity, forced from their homes into camps for years. It stands as this stark reminder of how civil liberties can be eroded even during a war fought, supposedly, for freedom and democracy. So while the war showcased America's incredible capacity for mobilization and eventual victory, it also exposed the fragility of civil rights for certain groups, even while fighting tyranny abroad.
So after World War II ends in 1945, the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerge as the two dominant superpowers, fundamentally reshaping global politics, kicking off the Cold War, which lasts until 1991. Expert, what was the defining nature of this new kind of global conflict? What were its unique challenges compared to, say, World War II?
The Cold War was just different. It was totally different. It was defined primarily by indirect confrontation, right? An intense ideological struggle between democracy and capitalism on one side, communism on the other. Not direct military conflict between the U.S. and USSR, mainly because of the terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation.
The mutually assured destruction, AD.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the unique challenges were things like a relentless arms race, constantly building more and more powerful weapons, a fierce competition for technological and scientific superiority, the space race being the prime example.
Right.
Widespread propaganda campaigns aimed at winning hearts and minds around the globe. And these proxy wars.
Korea, Vietnam.
Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan later. Conflicts fought by client states or through interventions in smaller nations rather than direct superpower clashes.
Right.
It was a conflict fought with espionage, economic pressure, cultural influence, just as much as military might. It kept the entire world on edge for almost half a century.
And domestically, during the early Cold War, America experienced this incredible economic boom, right? After 1948.
Yeah, the post-war boom was massive.
Leading to this idea of a middle-class standard of living for a majority of Americans, like 60% by the mid-50s, compared to only about 31% for the Depression, and of course the famous baby boom.
Right, 1945 to 1964, huge population growth.
In the space race, though, the Soviets initially took the lead. Sputnik in 57, huge shock. Yuri Gagarin, first man in space in 61.
Yeah, the U.S. felt like it was falling behind.
So how did President Kennedy's famous 1962 speech, "We choose to go to the moon," galvanize the U.S.? And what was the psychological impact of America eventually winning that race?
Oh, Kennedy's speech was just masterful political leadership. By setting this incredibly ambitious, almost audacious goal, land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade is out.
Seemed impossible at the time.
It really did. He tapped right into America's can-do spirit, its competitive drive, its fascination with frontiers. It transformed the space race from just a scientific contest into this symbol of national purpose ideological struggle against the Soviets.
Right.
So when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin actually landed on the moon in July 1969, televised live, hundreds of millions watched it around the world. It was seen as this decisive victory. Psychologically, it instilled this immense sense of national pride, competence, a belief in American exceptionalism, and technological superiority. It was a huge morale boost and a major propaganda win in the Cold War.
Now, the mid-20th century also saw the rise of these incredibly powerful social movements challenging the status quo at home, most notably the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
A landmark moment legally was the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, declaring state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional.
Huge. Overturning Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine, at least in education.
And the movement gained massive momentum with actions like the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955-56.
Led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., sparked by Rosa Parks' courageous act of defiance.
Right. And it worked, didn't it?
It did. After over a year of boycotting, a federal court ruled segregated bus seating violated the 14th Amendment. It was really the first large-scale demonstration against racial segregation, as the sources say, and it proved the power of nonviolent mass action.
Then you had the Little Rock 9 incident in 57.
Yeah, where President Eisenhower actually had to federalize the Arkansas National Guard and send in U.S. Army troops just to ensure 9 black students could safely attend the previously all-white Central High School.
showing federal commitment even against massive state resistance.
A very visible commitment.
And the movement continued with nonviolent protests like sit-ins at segregated lunch counters.
Starting in Greensboro, North Carolina, spreading like wildfire.
And the Freedom Rides in 1961, fearlessly challenging segregation on interstate buses, often facing brutal violence.
Yeah, the images from the Freedom Rides, the violence they endured, really shocked the nation and the world.
And these courageous efforts, this sustained pressure, it all culminates in landmark federal legislation, doesn't it?
Yes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, a sweeping law outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, education, and employment.
And the Voting Rights Act.
And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally prohibited racial discrimination in voting practices, striking down things like literacy tests and providing federal oversight. These two laws effectively dismantled the legal structure of Jim Crow segregation. Monumental achievement.
And alongside the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement also gained new energy, right?
Absolutely. Spurred in part by Betty Friedan's 1963 bestseller, The Feminine Mystique.
Which talked about the problem that has no name.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The widespread dissatisfaction many middle-class women felt being confined to domestic roles, and then the founding of the National Organization for Women, and now W, in 1966, pushing for equality.
Did they achieve similar legislative success?
Well, the big push for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, ultimately faced significant opposition and wasn't ratified by enough states. That was a major disappointment for the movement. But many important federal laws were passed during this period, establishing women's equal status in areas like pay equity, employment opportunities, educational access. Laws were also passed criminalizing spousal abuse and marital rape, which hadn't been illegal before in many places.
And then there's Roe v. Wade in 1973.
Right. The landmark Supreme Court decision deeming abortion a fundamental right under privacy protections, which of course remains one of the most contentious and debated legal and political issues in America to this day, illustrating how these struggles over rights and autonomy continue to evolve.
Now, the Cold War era wasn't just about domestic change. The U.S. got involved in these really divisive proxy wars that had huge impacts. Korea, 1950-53.
Yeah, ended in a stalemate, basically reinforcing the division of Korea, millions dead, established that precedent of limited war to contain communism.
And then Vietnam, 1954 to 1975.
Vietnam proved just bloody, deeply unpopular at home, and ultimately unsuccessful for the U.S. Cost 58,000 American lives, countless Vietnamese lives.
And really eroded trust in government, didn't it?
Massively. Led to huge anti-war protests, revealed the limits of American power, and created deep divisions in American society that lasted for decades.
Okay, bringing us closer to the present. The Cold War finally ends in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union,
leaving the U.S. as the world's sole superpower, a new, complex role.
But new challenges emerged fast. September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks.
Changed everything. Led to the War on Terror, protracted wars in Afghanistan starting that year, Iraq in 2003.
And controversial domestic measures, too, like the Patriot Act.
Right, expanding government surveillance powers in the name of national security, raising civil liberties concerns.
And then later in the decade, the Great Recession, 2007-2009.
Yeah, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, triggered by the housing market collapse, led to massive government bailouts and interventions to prevent a total economic meltdown.
The Obama administration follows, 2009-2017. What were some key moments there?
Well, President Obama issued an executive order banning torture methods used previously, oversaw the military operation that killed Osama bin Laden.
Right.
Internationally, signed the U.S. onto the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015, signaling a renewed commitment to tackling global warming. And domestically, a major social change marker was the Supreme Court's Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015.
Legalizing gay marriage nationwide.
Legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. A huge milestone for LGBTQ+ rights.
Then comes the first Trump administration, 2017 to 2021, characterized by this America First ideology.
Right, which translated into policies like stricter restrictions on immigration and asylum seekers, and withdrawing the U.S. from that Paris Agreement on climate change, reversing the previous administration's policy.
And Donald Trump made history in another way too, right?
Yes, he became the only U.S. president ever to be impeached twice by the House of Representatives. First, related to dealings with Ukraine, and the second time for his role in inciting the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol.
And that period coincided with another global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, starting to spread widely in the U.S. in early 2020. Led to unprecedented lockdowns, economic disruption, highest unemployment since the Depression for a time, and tragically a massive death toll. Over 1 million Americans had died by May 2022.
And the pandemic era was also marked by significant social unrest, particularly after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020.
Right, that sparked massive protests across the country and globally against police brutality and systemic racism.
Yeah.
Really brought issues of racial justice to the forefront of the national conversation in a powerful way.
Then the Biden administration, 2021 to 2025, oversaw the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan in 2021.
Which was quite chaotic,
Uh-huh.
and saw the Taliban rapidly retake control of the country.
Internationally, it provided extensive military and economic aid to Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022.
A major focus of foreign policy.
Domestically, a huge development was the Supreme Court's Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision in 2022.
Right, overturning Roe v. Wade, ending the constitutional right to abortion, and returning the authority to regulate or ban abortion entirely to individual states. A massive shift after nearly 50 years.
And on a historical note for the court itself,
Yes, Ketanji Brown Jackson was appointed and confirmed as the first Black woman ever to serve on the Supreme Court.
okay, and bringing us right up to the present outlook. The second Trump administration, beginning in 2025. Early actions have included pardoning many individuals convicted of offenses related to the January 6th Capitol attack.
A significant number, around 1,500.
And the creation of a new department, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE,
Led by businessman Elon Musk.
led by Elon Musk, tasked specifically with cutting federal spending, signaling perhaps new directions in government structure and fiscal policy priorities.
Definitely suggests a focus on shrinking the size and scope of the federal government.
Wow. What an incredible whirlwind journey we've just taken through American history. From those indigenous beginnings, colonial foundations, through moments of just profound division, radical transformation with industrialization, right into the complex, often really tumultuous challenges of contemporary America.
It really is an epic story.
It's a story of constant change, isn't it? Immense resilience, too, but also the ongoing, often messy, sometimes contradictory nature of this American experiment.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect all this to the bigger picture, it just reminds us that history isn't some static list of dates you memorize in school.
Right.
It's this dynamic interplay of events, powerful ideas, competing interests, and countless individual human experiences all shaping each other. American history is this continuous process of the nation grappling with its own founding ideals, liberty, equality, and the often harsh, evolving realities on the ground. It's constantly being redefined by the choices people make. It's very much a story that's still being written.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So, as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive we've taken today, maybe consider this. How do those long-standing tensions and compromises that were embedded right into the nation's origins? Think about the flaws in the Articles of Confederation, the fundamental contradiction of slavery existing alongside claims of liberty, the ongoing debates about individual rights versus the collective good, the proper role and power of government. How do those deep historical currents continue to shape the headlines we see flashing across our screens today? And maybe, just maybe, how might understanding these roots help us navigate the future a little more clearly?